Hi, I'm Donna King, Editor-in-Chief of the Carolina Journal. Welcome to The Debrief. This is going to be our weekly breakdown of everything that's happened in the North Carolina government complex. We're going to start bringing it to you every week. We notice there's so much going on here in Raleigh and what's going on with the state government, stuff you needed to know. And this is a great place that we're going to be bringing it to you each and every week. Right now, this week, we have with us, of course, Mitch Kokai with the John Locke Foundation. He's going to be lending all his expertise to what we're talking about today. And Theresa Opeka, political reporter for Carolina Journal. Welcome. I'm glad we're going to be doing this every week together. We're looking forward to this. And then, of course, Brooke Medina from the John Locke Foundation, lending her expertise. And I know if you're down there at the General Assembly, you have seen him around the building all week. It has been a crazy week. Let's hit the highlights first. President Joe Biden was in Durham this week. He was over at Wolfspeed. He was talking a lot about what's been going on with the economy, of course, touting all of his accomplishments with the economy and saying that MAGA Republicans were going to try and roll back all of his progress. We have a poll that's fresh off the presses, and it compares him against Ron DeSantis. We're going to have the details on that poll coming up in just a few minutes. Then again, we were talking about at the General Assembly, super busy week. Veto override. First one since 2018. Of course, Alex is going to be bringing us all the details on that. And then other big news, the budget. Of course, House leadership rolled out the budget this week. There's a ton of policy in it. I think let's start there. Alex, tell me what you found out about the budget this week. There was a big press conference, and there's a lot of policy in this.
That's right. So there is a lot of policy. The top line budget numbers, so the budget spend is going to be $27.9 billion, okay. Which is something the House and Senate had already agreed upon. So we kind of already knew that, which is a 10.5% increase from the previous budget. What that number looks like, it might sound big, but when you account for inflation along with our surplus that we got, It's actually a little bit lower than we kind of expected. Right.
But you saw a lot of policy in this. I was really surprised at the amount of education and funding for the cap on state spending on abortions, things like that.
Absolutely. So one of the interesting things about this budget is that Governor Cooper last week signed Medicaid expansion into what will be law. However, it stipulates that the budget must pass, and so if the House and Senate agree on a budget, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the governor to sign the budget, no matter what is in there.
Sure. Mitch, what do you think? This is something we've been following a long time, done lots of budgets. This is a new one for me.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think Alex hit on a key point, and that is that in this budget, there is this Medicaid expansion deal that Roy Cooper has been pushing for since he was campaigning for governor the first time. Republicans had not been willing to go along with it. Now they finally said, yes, we can do this. They came up with a deal. They passed a bill. He signed it into law, but it is entirely dependent on there being an enacted budget. And so I think ever since that provision was put in there, people have been asking, well, what are they going to stick in the budget that Cooper's not going to like? And so I think you see some things like expanding school choice, like enhancing and speeding up some tax cuts that would give the governor heartburn. There are going to be some other things in there, not only in this budget, but also in the Senate version of the budget. And I think to some extent they're going to be daring Roy Cooper to pull out that veto stamp saying, hey, we've got Medicaid expansion. Are you going to take all these other things?
Sure. So, Theresa, this might be a trade-off. Do you think the governor is going to be able to stand up to this? Because they've kind of got him over a barrel. Maybe he's already signed Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard for him. It's like what Mitch was just explaining. We just saw the first veto override this week. I think he's in a tough spot right now.
Sure.
I think he had his glory days maybe behind him. At this point.
Sure. So now, Brooke, this is the big question, right? John Locke Foundation policy. Is the policy that's in this budget worth? Is the juice worth the squeeze of Medicaid expansion, right? Because that's the big question. It's a huge undertaking, 600,000 people to our healthcare system.
Yeah, that is the big question of the hour, really, is just, at the end of the day, is even a budget like this, where there are a lot of carrots for Governor Cooper. I mean, there's not only what Theresa mentioned, but also the teacher pay raises. Those are sizable, especially compared to previous years. But is that enough for fiscal conservatives as well to feel comfortable with this? And I would say the Medicaid expansion question is essentially either the gift or the drama that's going to keep on giving here, because we know that is going to far outlast even this biennium sort of budget. And so My thought is, at least on the Locke policy analyst side, that this still isn't a good deal for North Carolinians.
Sure, Alex. Pay raises. Brooke just mentioned pay raises. There's a lot of them in this budget.
Right, that's right. So yeah, the teacher pay raises, I think it's going to, per Jeffrey Elmore, who's a representative from...
and a teacher.
Yep, and a teacher.
Or a teacher, yeah, of course.
That's right. So he announced in the Appropriations Committee meeting this morning that teacher pay raises are going to increase teacher pay, so maybe not necessarily teacher salary, because there is a little bit of a difference there.
Okay.
But teacher pay will be north of $62,000 a year.
Wow.
After.
On average.
Yep, on average.
Very interesting. All right. So we just mentioned Governor Cooper in a tough spot. He was over there in Durham with President Biden. The big question is, does Biden, he may have some supporters in Cooper, but does he have it among voters? Of course, John Locke Foundation put out, there's a CIVITAS poll out that pits him against Ron DeSantis. What did it tell us?
Yeah, this is something that, especially if you're a Politico, you have been waiting for this. Right. And so we polled not only DeSantis versus Biden, but Trump versus Biden, as well as Pence versus Biden. And DeSantis is the only potential Republican nominee that we polled that comes out ahead of Biden. I think that this is something that is certainly, if you're the DeSantis campaign, you're looking at a swing state like North Carolina, you've got to be encouraged by this. It's still within the margin of error. DeSantis outpaces Biden by about 3%. Something that's really important to note in this poll is that independents get a bump for DeSantis when polled against Biden versus Trump. So Trump loses independents here in North Carolina, or unaffiliated voters, which is definitely our largest voting bloc, or our fastest growing. But DeSantis takes 9% of those independents away from Biden. Another thing, when Biden and Trump are matched up together, women go for Biden by 5% more than they did with DeSantis. So I would say this is really, the tea leaves on this are that women voters and unaffiliateds are definitely that swing vote that's meant to, that needs to be captured by either Biden, DeSantis, or whoever else is in play.
Sure. So if we see DeSantis, Mitch, the really passionate Trump supporters are like, I want the real deal. I'm not interested in a tribute ban. Is that what he is? Do you think a lot of these Trump supporters will be able to make the jump to DeSantis?
Well, if he's the nominee, they will. They're not going to go for Joe Biden. But I think the most interesting thing about this poll to me is that this is great ammunition for Ron DeSantis to say, look, if you are Trump-like, he's going to lose. Look at what my numbers are compared to Joe Biden. I'm going to win, and I'm going to win among those categories of voters that you need. And he's going to use that as his ammunition moving forward. Because you basically have the Trump people who are always going to vote for Trump no matter what.
Sure.
He can't do anything about them. But you have the other people who, like Trump, might prefer Trump to DeSantis, but they also want to win.
Sure.
And if DeSantis can convince them you can't win with Trump, but you can win with me, he might be able to get their votes.
Very interesting. Also polled some constitutional amendments. What was the take on those?
The constitutional amendments tended to have a lot of support. The ones that we polled, the one that's questionable is the one to try to get the literacy test out of the state constitution.
Questionable.
It's because it's so close, and part of that is because a lot of people really don't know the history. Basically, they see this constitutional requirement that you are supposed to be able to read, to be able to take part in elections, and they think, well, literacy's good. Let's promote literacy. But that's not what that part of the Constitution was about. It was designed to stop African Americans from being able to vote years ago. It's not operable because of legislation passed on the federal level in the mid-1960s. Still, it sits in our Constitution. And once before, North Carolina voters turned down the opportunity to take it out. So it's really going to take a concerted campaign to show people why this provision was in there and why it should be taken out.
Sure. Alex, you're down there. Do you hear members talking about this? Because one of the things that I heard, one of the complaints I heard about this is that the provision does say you have to be able to read and write certain parts of the Constitution in English. Perhaps that's part of the issue. Are you hearing members down there talk about this?
I think a lot of members fear that putting this on the ballot and having it fail again, especially in 2023, is a major concern. They feel like that would be pretty embarrassing if they were to do that, because it is so obvious to a lot of people who are familiar with the history, but when you put it in front of voters, they may not necessarily see behind the scenes there.
So the depth of the history of this being, more of a Jim Crow era,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Mitch is 100% right about a widespread education campaign being necessary for this to happen.
Very interesting.
In fact, our own Andy Jackson, he said that to legislators when they were talking about it. He said, look, if you're going to do this, and we think you should, but you need to have an education campaign or else there's a fear that it could fail.
Very interesting. Brooke, what are your thoughts? Oh, yeah, Alice, you
One last
yeah.
thing on that point is and something that I know Dr. Jackson has proposed is putting this measure on the primary ballot rather than the general election ballot. And what that does is the primary election voters are a little bit more educated, and so the assumption is that they would be more likely to support the measure. But
Oh, interesting. So what else did this poll tell us? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there were some other findings that I think were particularly interesting. Just staying on the amendments for a moment.
Sure.
The citizens-only voting amendment, that was one that polled really well, both not only with Republicans, independents, but also Democrats. I think that's another one that is, when we're thinking about states like New York, where they're allowing folks that aren't actually from there or aren't even U.S. citizens to vote, this is something that North Carolina voters, we care about election integrity, fairness, and this is something that it seems like is a bipartisan issue that people can get around. So that's a good thing. Something else that really stood out in this poll was that Republicans generally are doing really, really well on these generic ballots. And we're still, how many months away from the election? 18. And so I think that is an encouraging sign for Republicans. They're only leading by a little bit, but when you're looking at gubernatorial generic races, congressional and state legislature, Republicans are leading in all of those.
Very interesting. That is really valuable. We were just talking about a piece of North Carolina history, of course, the requirement that you have to be able to read and write. There's another piece of North Carolina history that people maybe aren't as familiar with. Of course, Governor Cooper vetoing the gun bill that contained that Jim Crow era pistol permit. This particular pistol permit law dates back to when a sheriff could pick and choose who got a pistol permit. It's now become redundant, but of course, Governor Cooper vetoed it, right?
He did. And he even created a special commission earlier, I believe last week, on, for gun safety in the state. But yes, he did veto it, and he was deeply dismayed when the override came this week. He sent out a tweet, actually the day after the school shootings.
This backfired on him because the idea that you would politicize something like this clear attack on a group of families and a church based on their religion is extremely alarming. Brooke, what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, just as a parent, seeing that, knowing that there is just heartbreak going around Nashville and in this community, and just the hurt and the ache. And then just to your south, Governor Cooper is trying to politicize this and scold the General Assembly for a common sense reform that has nothing to do with what happened there in Virginia. And I think it's politically irresponsible, but also just when you think of it from a perspective of a parent that is suffering right now and mourning the death of their child, it's irresponsible, it's immature.
Sure. So Alex, do you think that had something to do with people defecting and voting to override?
Yeah, I do think it was interesting because, to Brooke's point, he's also talking about several of his Democratic colleagues in the House who supported this measure
that was
initially.
Chaos.
It was chaos.
Yeah.
So again, on the override vote to override Cooper's veto of the bill, it was interesting because no Democrats did support it. However, 3 were absent, notably, and that was Representative Michael Ray, Representative Tricia Cotham, and Representative Cecil Brockman.
Okay.
And so I think that caused some chaos among the Democrats. And I saw Robert Reeves, the Democratic minority leader, put out a statement almost threatening primaries against people who were absent on this measure. So
wow.
Yeah, Tricia Cotham really got roasted on social media for avoiding it. And she's a long-haul COVID survivor, and that's what she said. She missed the vote because she had an appointment because she's had COVID 3 times.
Wow.
Unbelievable. So, I mean, she really got eviscerated on social media.
Sure.
So,
yeah, even by legacy media folks, like WRAL, some of their reporters.
Right. Wasn't there a controversy, too, that maybe this was like a ploy behind the scenes? A rumor, of course, being spread that was why they were absent, but...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it may be that, Speaker Moore has spent some time building relationships with some of the more moderate members of the Democrat caucus, and in some ways, Mitch, that may have been to his benefit this time. But this is also about the rules, right? And Reeves was a part of that process.
It is about the rules. on the 3 absent lawmakers, all of them ended up saying that there was some sort of reason why they weren't there.
Okay.
Brockman said he was at an emergency medical issue. Tricia Cotham said she had told everyone ahead of time she wasn't going to be there because of her medical appointment. And then Ray said he had a family emergency. But there will always be some people who are saying, wait a minute, this is an excuse. We've seen this happen before when a vote is needed here and there, that someone ends up taking a walk.
Right.
And if they get called on it, they have an excuse. We heard last year in the vote on the sports gambling, there was a member who stepped out and said he had a dentist appointment. It was like at 6:30 at night and lasted 5 minutes. So you had that happen. But in terms of the rules, yes, the issue that came up with on the rules was when the House took the override vote. Dustin Hall, the rules chairman, basically said, all right, let's just move the previous question, no debate. And then as the vote was being taken, Robert Reeves, the minority leader, tried to speak. And the speaker, Tim Moore, said, no, you can't. We're in the vote. The rules don't allow, once the question's been called, if it's the reconsideration of a veto, there is no more debate. And so Robert Reeves then afterward said, oh, I'm sorry that the kids up in the gallery had to see this. And then John Torbett came back and said, well, those kids up in the gallery should also know we've debated this for hours and hours before. So yes, there was a little bit of dissension there.
Sure, absolutely. Alex, you were there. I mean, it sounded like Wild West was going on.
Yeah, that's right. And also, just for a little bit of context for the listeners and the viewers, the 3 Democrats being absent was significant because 3 Democrats being off the table, along with every Republican being there, means that the Republicans have a supermajority. And so that is the reason for why this is so significant.
Yeah,
these 3
it's
Democrats being
3/5
absent.
of the people present and voting.
Okay.
So they don't need to get to 72 votes if there aren't all 120 people there. Since there were 3 missing, they only needed the 71 Republican votes.
Okay, so now it's law, right? There's no...
It is the law now.
It is the law.
And several sheriffs have already been circulating
Really?
to their counties that this is law now.
Okay, so what does it do?
So it repeals the pistol purchase permit that's been in law for over 100 years now, I believe.
Okay.
And so basically what that was is, in addition to the NICS federal background check, you would also have to, in order to obtain a pistol, you have to go to your sheriff, your local sheriff of your county, and get a permit to do so. So it was just sort of a extra regulatory piece of red tape that you have to go through, a hurdle you have to jump to get a pistol.
And some sheriffs were moving them through, some were not.
Yes, that's right. So most of the sheriffs were moving them through at a pretty reasonable rate, but there were a few exceptions to that, especially in the urban, mostly Democratic areas.
Interesting.
And it's important to note that the Sheriff's Association had come out in favor of making this change. There were some sheriffs who didn't want to, but the Sheriff's Association as a group, which means the majority of them, were fine with getting rid of this. And I think Alex probably knows this from reporting on it, that it's because of that federal background check. Many of them, the only thing they were doing was the same federal background check.
Right.
And so they figured, why repeat that process?
Okay, very
Something else
interesting.
important in that was the gun safety, gun safe storage requirements and education related to that I think is really important, because when you juxtapose this, of course, you know, the Democratic talking point was that the Republicans were supporting something that was going to make gun violence an increased problem here in North Carolina, whereas on the flip side, a Republican talking point might be that they were, the Democrats that voted against it were opposing safe gun storage messaging and information.
So they combined multiple pieces of gun legislation in this one bill.
Yes.
Right,
Very
and,
interesting.
and the third piece was the one that said if you are a church and you have a school in your church, that you could have a gun in the church as long as it was not when any school activity was taking place. The current law, I think, was a little unclear about whether a church could allow guns if it also had a school.
Sure.
And basically this says, yes, you can, as long as it's not when anything is happening dealing with the school.
And if school doesn't want to do it, they can always post a no guns allowed sign. That was one of the things that they
Right,
could do.
and the church could too. This was not saying you had to let people have
Right.
guns. It was you could allow people to have guns, and a lot of churches, I think, wanted that for safety reasons.
Very interesting. All right, we're going to move on to this last one. This has got to be the most outrageous story that I saw this week. I don't know if you all caught it, but this testimony from the SBI Director, this was fascinating. He came before the Oversight Reform Committee and just laid out Governor Cooper's senior staff. Mitch, fill us in a little bit about this.
Yeah, the SBI Director, Bob Schirmeyer, is going to be leaving that post at the end of June.
Okay.
And he was appointed to this job by former Governor Pat McCrory, a Republican, and his term is coming up. He basically went before the legislature, this oversight group, and said, look, the governor's senior staff, his chief of staff, legal counsel, were trying to get me to resign. They were threatening me. They said there was going to be some huge investigation against me, which apparently has not taken effect. But he said he felt threatened. He also said that some of his senior staffers seemed to be working more for the governor than for him. Right. And the idea was, look, I'm leaving, so it's not really going to affect me one way or another, but legislature, you need to do something to help protect the SBI from the politics that's coming from the governor's office. It was very eye-opening and very interesting. For people who don't know, the SBI for many years was part of the Department of Justice, meaning it was under the Attorney General, up through much of the time that Roy Cooper was Attorney General.
Sure.
But in 2014, the General Assembly, when Cooper was still AG, took the SBI out from under the Attorney General, put it under basically the governor's office in the Department of Public Safety, and now you're seeing some of the fallout from that, with Cooper trying to play some sort of political role, at least in the words of Bob Schirmeyer.
Sure. Well, this political strong-arming, has the governor responded to these accusations? And this seems to be, it's the kind of thing I've heard before, and just, people have alluded to it, and there have been rumors. This is the first time I've seen sworn testimony from a government leader about this.
Yeah, I personally haven't seen him responding to this week.
Sure.
I think he's been busy about the override and about Medicaid expansion, and
Sure.
for President Biden coming in, he took his victory laps earlier in the week.
Right.
I think that's been preoccupying him, so I personally haven't seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did make a comment about it.
Right, very interesting.
Yeah.
Of course. Now, this SBI thing is, though, addressed in the budget?
So yes, this is addressed in the budget.
Okay.
So shortly after Schirmeyer testified in front of the House Oversight Committee, the budget was released the next day, including this SBI provision to move it out from under Cooper administration.
It was
I did
really
think that was
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, this testimony was really gripping. At one point, it seemed emotional. Like, this was a really hard thing for him to go through. What are the members saying about this?
Yeah. So it does, as indicated by the budget, I think the majority of the members are supportive of this measure, at least on the House side. I don't know that I've seen anything from the Senate in terms of whether or not they support this.
Very interesting.
But yes, it was interesting. It was personal at times. I was there for at least a good part of it. And there were certain things Schirmeyer wasn't allowed to comment on.
Okay.
There may be legal reasons for that. I know he mentioned anytime there was a personnel issue, he refrained from comment on
Sure.
that.
He came across as a really upstanding guy, and this, I don't know him personally, but it really seemed like he was really moved by this experience. What are your thoughts? Is this too much power in one agency?
I think that's a really good question, and that's what lawmakers are grappling with right now, because Schirmeyer's testimony certainly indicates that there is a red flag here somewhere. There's a problem. And I would just say, thinking about the national FBI and just all of the drama and the politicization around them, we don't want that for our State Bureau of Investigation. So the more you can make it depoliticized, independent, with still plenty of measures of accountability, I think the better for taxpayers and the better for our citizens in keeping them safe.
Absolutely.
And another piece of this is the future of the crime lab, which is not part of the SBI, but that was a point of confusion. In fact, at one point, one of the Democratic legislators said, "Oh, I visited the SBI, and I had a great time out there." And Schirmeyer said, "Well, crime lab is not part of the SBI, but we'd be happy to have you come out and visit us sometime." So I think the budget also addresses what to do with the crime lab as well, which is another important thing. We know there have been problems with the crime lab in the past that helped cause some problems with old prosecutions.
Sure, we'll be watching this really closely, because this is a huge shift in how the SBI is managed, because they said that they didn't add an agent for something like a decade. So we'll be watching this throughout. I really appreciate y'all being a part of our inaugural debrief, and thank you for watching. Please, if you want to see more of this content, we're going to be bringing it back every week to you. Like and follow to get the latest on what's coming from Carolina Journal, and of course follow our social media and check carolinajournal.com. I'm Donna King. Thank you all, and tune in next week for the debrief.